Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
Crazy story out of North Carolina, sent to me by a whole bunch of people. The Charlotte Observer has it. Haley Fowler wrote it. Worker made $4 million in North Carolina by secretly selling off his company's equipment. That's one way to do it. It's crazy. 43-year-old man, North Carolina, accused of secretly auctioning off his company's rental equipment and rerouting payments to himself, has pleaded guilty. So there's no question that he says, yeah, I did it. The man entered a guilty plea on charges of wire fraud and money laundering before a federal judge on Thursday. That's according to the U.S. Attorney's Office of the Western District of North Carolina. In a press release, he faces up to 30 years in prison and agreed to forfeit at least $4 million in the alleged fraud. So looks like they can get some of the money back, but question is how much. Also, you might be wondering, isn't this just like theft or embezzlement or something common like that? Why do we go with wire fraud and money laundering? Well, to get it into federal court, there's got to be a federal question or federal crime. And in this case, it looks like this may have been happening interstate. So the business is in one state and vehicles and stuff are being sold in other states, and therefore you have federal issues. With this plea, the man takes responsibility for a regrettable mistake, one of his defense attorneys said. He will comply with the court's orders and society's expectations. I laugh because, number one, he has more than one attorney. There's nothing wrong with that. You can hire as many as you like. Hire a fleet of attorneys. Hire a crowd of attorneys. Get a whole herd of attorneys. Have them stampede into the courtroom. And maybe you'll get more justice. But also he's going to comply with society's expectations. Because we've had such high expectations for this man previously, and he let us down. Now, he's from Denver. But Denver, of course, is a town in North Carolina, north of Charlotte, on Lake Norman, as opposed to the Denver out west. From 2019 to 2020, prosecutors say that the man sold close to 400 pieces of equipment without his company's knowledge through an online auction house, then funneled the money through shell companies back to himself, and then he bought a condo, an RV, a boat, and several cars with the proceeds. So if you're rolling in cash, you don't just buy one car. You don't buy a couple of cars. You buy several cars. The man reportedly worked for an equipment rental business based in Fort Mill, South Carolina, and that was identified in court filings simply as Company A. So apparently, the company managed to keep their name out of the story for whatever reason. They'd like to do that, I guess. As a fleet manager, the man was the fleet manager. He was reportedly responsible for getting rid of old equipment. So he had some authority and some access to the stuff to make this work. But of course, it appears he exceeded both. While he was working for the business, prosecutors said the man started two companies called Second Life Equipment and All Seasons Sales and Service. The abbreviation for All Seasons Sales and Service, of course, is ASSS. Both were reportedly shell companies. The man then pretended to be someone named Eric Dixon, representing the shell companies, and he reached out to a third-party auction house that sells used construction equipment. He then told them Company A had sold him used equipment, and he was looking to find buyers through the auction house. The equipment, of course, that he was selling didn't belong to him or his businesses. It was owned by the company that employed him, who had not authorized him to do what he was doing with their stuff. In truth and in fact, he was reselling the assets through his shell company, causing the proceeds of those sales to be sent to an account over which he and another individual exercised control and keeping the proceeds for himself. The question is, what happened to the other individual? He's accused of, the primary defendant here, is accused of manipulating documents at his company to hide the missing equipment and resulting payouts. Prosecutors said he ultimately sold 398 assets and defrauded his company out of more than $4 million. He reportedly spent the money on a condo in South Carolina that cost $170,000, a boat that cost $90,000, 3 Chevrolet vehicles between $17,000 and $45,000 each, a $38,000 Cadillac, and a $50,000 RV. Now, the purchase of the RV is a conundrum. I've said before, you should never buy an RV unless you know what you're getting yourself into. Of course, if you're buying it with stolen money, it's not costing you as much as it's costing the average person. But I would not recommend you do that either. So I wouldn't suggest anyone, even a criminal, ever buy an RV unless you really know what you're getting yourself into. But one of the things I've noticed about a lot of these stories where people get money they shouldn't have, they steal it or they embezzle it or whatever they do to get the money, they often go out and squander it. They squander it. All the people who got the PPP loans they shouldn't have, and they're buying like Lamborghinis and Ferraris. There's nothing wrong with buying a Lamborghini or a Ferrari with your own money should you choose to do so. But when somebody falls into $17 million or $4 million or whatever it is, and they run out and just buy a whole fleet of cars or a whole herd of attorneys, you realize that they're not quite handling the money wisely, but I guess it's kind of like easy come, easy go. So the fraud came to light because of the man's end-of-year review in May of 2020, according to court documents. When his managers called him in for a meeting, he went to Florida instead. Pro tip. If you are going to try to avoid the harsh reality of what's going to happen to you in America, you should probably leave America. And Florida is actually one of the 50 states. So going to Florida to get away from your troubles, small ones maybe, not ones like these. So while he was there, he's accused of going into the company's stores and impersonating employees to get access to information. The company then fired him in May of 2020, and he drained his shell company's bank accounts the next day. So I guess the thing going to Florida wasn't him trying to flee prosecution, but may have been instead him trying to get into work computers and so on, because the company has locations around the country. That would be Company A has locations around the country. So the business that he worked for, though, is in Fort Mill, South Carolina. That would be Company A. And he was in a position to where he had access to the stuff and could sell it off. And presumably this company has stuff that they sell off, and generally speaking what they do, I'm guessing, is what a lot of companies do, and they simply sell the stuff off when they're done with it, and the proceeds go back into the company, and they do business that way. This is a great example, though, of why when you run a company and you give somebody authority like that, you've got to actually have checks in place to make sure that someone's watching over them so that it doesn't happen. Quite often we hear about these stories where, I've mentioned this before, the Little League, some organization that supports some hobby with a lot of members, for instance. We often hear about groups like that have money. And so they'll often get a volunteer. Someone in the group goes, oh, I'm an accountant, or I know someone who's an accountant. My wife's an accountant. My husband's an accountant. And they get a volunteer accountant to come in to save some money. And then what happens is the accountant has this money going through their hands, and suddenly they've got bills to pay at home, and they borrow some money. I'll pay it back later. And we hear these stories. And it doesn't make a difference how much money is being stolen. Theft is theft. It makes a difference when you go to court and you're prosecuted for it, of course, because the amount of money you steal might make it a more serious crime than otherwise. But you often hear about it at these little organizations that can't afford a loss. This big company here, I'm not saying they can afford a $4 million loss. $4 million is $4 million. It's a lot of money. That's the kind of money you can go out and buy an RV and 3 Chevrolets with and hire a herd of attorneys. But it doesn't matter how big or small the organization is. You've got to have somebody overseeing the people who've got the ability to handle the money, handle the books, or dispose of property owned by the company. And the fact that this happened almost 400 times and it didn't get caught till they did a year-end review. Maybe they should put in better systems and better checks and balances into their systems to make sure it doesn't happen again. But crazy story. Haley Fowler wrote it. Charlotte Observer published it. And by the way, whenever I say Charlotte Observer, it actually gives me a very, very warm feeling, because I wrote a book. I've written quite a bit about Bobby Isaac, who drove the car that model is based off of. And Charlotte, of course, is ground zero for NASCAR. And so when I was doing research on the early days of NASCAR in the 60s and 70s when Bobby raced, I would find that all the information I needed was in the Charlotte Observer because they covered so much for NASCAR. So I actually took a trip down to Charlotte, I'm guessing in the early 2000s, 2001, 2002, to do research. And I actually flew down to Charlotte, spent a couple days down there at the Mecklenburg Library, if my memory serves me correctly, and spent a couple days just going through the microfilm, winding microfilm. And whenever I saw a page I liked, putting a dime in and hitting print, and just printing out stacks and stacks and stacks of stories. about early NASCAR. Absolutely fascinating stuff. But I love the Charlotte Observer because I spent a couple days in Charlotte going through the microfilm, reading old copies of it. It's like going back in time. Fascinating stuff. So thanks a lot. Questions or comments, put them below. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. I owe my solitude to other people.